Number 10. The Goliath, the robot demolition vehicle. Goliath, or the Leichtladungsträger, was a German expendable miniature tracked vehicle designed to deliver an explosive device by remote control. There were two types, battery-powered, with a 60 kg charge, or a larger petrol engine version that could carry a 100 kg device up to 650 meters from the controller. Goliath was to be used against buildings, bunkers or even enemy troops and vehicles if the opportunity arose. Some were used to clear minefields. Unfortunately for the Germans, the trailing control wires were vulnerable to being cut, and the vehicle itself was slow and had poor ground clearance. 2,650 were built between April 1942 and September 1944, but were rarely effective. The Germans also experimented with larger, radio-controlled vehicles that could drop a charge close to their intended target and then retire to a safe distance, but these too were a waste of resources. Number 9. The V3, Hitler's supergun. The Vergeltungswaffe, retaliation weapon, 3 was a German supergun designed to bombard London from an underground complex 100 miles away at Meaux, near Calais in northern France. The V3 was constructed on a multi-chamber principle whereby secondary charges firing in sequence along the main barrel accelerated a shell to the velocity required to reach its target. A battery of 25 gun tubes were sunk into inclined tunnels in the ground, further protected by a vast concrete slab. It was planned to bombard London at a rate of 600 shells an hour. The Allies assumed the site was part of the V-2 rocket program and launched bombing attacks in late 1943. Despite intense work by the Germans to finish the project, it was finally put out of action by a raid on July 6, 1944 before a single shell had been fired. Number 8. The White Rabbit Nelly. The trench-digging machine. The White Rabbit or Nelly were two of the nicknames given to a trench-digging machine built by the Royal Navy and known officially as Cultivator No. 6. It was based on an idea first proposed by Winston Churchill during the First World War, which he revived in 1939, as First Lord of the Admiralty. Nelly was intended to burrow towards the enemy line, excavating a trench wide enough for troops to advance behind. The huge 130-ton machine combined a plow and cylindrical cutter but carried no weapons. The device may have had some merit on the Western Front during the First World War, but was utterly unnecessary on the Second World War battlefield, and the idea was eventually dropped after a handful of machines had been constructed. Number 7. The Smith gun. Firepower for the Home Guard. During the Second World War, Britain's Home Guard was famous for making do with outdated weapons as industry concentrated on supplying the regular army with modern equipment. In particular, there were very few anti-tank guns, a shortage which retired British Army Major William H. Smith intended to put right. His unusual design for a 3-inch smoothbore gun was put into production in 1941, but only after many safety improvements had been imposed. The Smith gun had to be tipped onto its side to fire, one of its wheels acting as a base plate. It had a low muzzle velocity and was only accurate to about 200 yards, assuming ammunition was available to fire, which was rarely. 4,000 guns were made, but they only really had value as propaganda. Number 6. The Maginot Line failed French defenses. The Maginot Line was the French response to German rearmament in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. Built between 1929 and 1939, and named after a French defense minister, the line was a complex network of fortresses, bunkers, obstacles and artillery positions along France's border with Switzerland, Germany, and Luxembourg. The line was only partially extended north of this because it was assumed that any future German invasion attempt would be met and defeated in Belgium, hopefully with British assistance. The Maginot Line was seen as a sensible way to maximize the military potential of a limited number of troops, but it also reflected France's static, defensive mentality which was exploited by Nazi Germany in May 1940. As expected, Hitler's forces invaded neutral Belgium, but the focus of the attack was through the undefended Ardennes forest. The Maginot Line was quickly outflanked, and French forces caught off balance by the speed of the German advance. Within 6 weeks France had surrendered. Number 5. The Tog. A First World War tank revived. In 1939 the Ministry of Supply set up a committee of the principal tank designers from the First World War, with the object of looking into current British tank development. The Old Gang, as they were known, came up with their own concept for a heavy tank, known as TOG-1. It was a long, heavily armored machine, able to cross trenches in terrain cratered by shells. Its armament was mounted in sponsons on either side of the hull. It was in effect a machine designed to refight the First World War, and showed just how remote the committee was from modern developments. Its transmission and steering system were also needlessly complex. A second prototype, TOG-2, featured a revolving turret and other improvements, but the tank was still too cumbersome and too complicated to be adopted by the War Office. Number 4. The Covenanter, Britain's worst tank. At the outbreak of the Second World War the British Army had three types of tank: light tanks for reconnaissance, heavily armored infantry tanks to support frontal attacks, and fast cruiser tanks to exploit the gaps made in the enemy defenses. One of the latter was the 813 Mk3, cruiser tank MKV, Covenanter. It was designed in 1939, and looked good on the drawing board with its large wheels, low profile and rakishly sloped armor. Large numbers were ordered as Britain frantically rearmed. But its 2 PDR gun and 30mm armor were already outclassed when it was delivered in 1941, and worse defects lurked under the bonnet. The Covenanter suffered from major engine cooling problems which were never overcome. It was so unreliable that it never went to war, and the 1,771 tanks produced were used only for training. Number 3. The Maus, Hitler's giant tank. The Panzerkampfwagen Maus, designed by Ferdinand Porsche, was the ultimate expression of Hitler's desire to produce an indestructible super-heavy tank. It was first proposed in 1942, but few in the German High Command saw the need for this 200-ton monster. Trials began in 1943, but there were constant mechanical problems associated with the drivetrain. The tracks were driven by electric motors powered by a huge Daimler-Benz aircraft engine, but top speed was barely 12 miles per hour. The Maus had armor up to 240 mm thick and a 12.8 cm gun. Although there were plans to build 150 tanks, only 2 prototypes, 2 hulls and 1 turret, were ever completed. Number 2. The Krumlov. The gun that fired round corners. The Krumlov was a curved barrel attachment for the German Sturmgewehr 44, StG-44, assault rifle, which enabled the weapon to be fired around corners. Its shape meant it could also be used from within a tank to counter enemy infantry armed with mines or other anti-tank weapons. In use, it was found that the barrel attachment became distorted and quickly wore out from the pressure of the rounds being fired. Also, the bullets often shattered on exiting the Krumlov. Although a failure at the time, the concept has been revived with some modern weapons, allowing the user to engage the enemy without exposing themselves. Number 1. The Panjandrum. The ultimate invasion weapon. This ungainly device was intended to be used against the beach defenses of Hitler's Atlantic Wall. It consisted of 2 rocket-propelled wheels, 10 feet in diameter, joined by a cylinder filled with explosives. The Panjandrum was designed by the British Admiralty's Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, and named after a piece of 18th-century nonsense prose. It would be launched from a landing craft, accelerate up the beach and blow a hole in the seawall or any other concrete obstacles in its path. Tests in 1943 and 1944 were a disaster. The rockets attached to the wheels often failed or detached themselves, and the Panjandrum went everywhere except in a straight line. It was never used in action.